If you are a regular listener to the Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and in each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research and their experiences. So put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. My guest for this episode was Dr Aliya Hamid Rao, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Singapore Management University. And I spoke to Aliya about her new book, a book called Crunch Time, How Married Couples Confront Unemployment. And this is a really interesting piece of research, particularly for gender, to look at how unemployment is dealt quite differently from when it's the mother or the female that's unemployed compared to the father unemployed. So without further ado, let's go over to the interview. Hi, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to the podcast. Would you like to start by introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Aliya Rao. I'm a sociologist. I'm an assistant professor at Singapore Management University.
Thank you, Aliya. And how long have you been in Singapore in your current role?
So I've been here for 2 years. I came here in July 2018.
Excellent. And what's your area of expertise? What do you specialize in?
So very broadly, I do research in gender, work, and family. More specifically, it's my most recent project was on unemployment, the gendered experiences of unemployment.
Thank you. So what about the subject of sociology? Where did that start for you?
Yeah, it was a very kind of circuitous path to sociology. I started by way of literature for my undergrad degree, then development studies. I was very interested in gender. And when I was exploring PhD opportunities and so on, the kind of discipline that seemed to most rigorously to me, and especially empirically, deal with issues of gender was sociology. So that's how I ended up applying to a PhD program in sociology.
Great. And you said you were interested in gender. Was there any particular sociologists that you were really passionate about when you were studying?
Yeah, and I mean, I would say even still, one of my sort of favorite sociologists would be Arlie Hochschild. I really enjoy her. I think her writing is firstly beautiful and so accessible, but also the way she kind of plumbs qualitative data to explain why people behave the way they do, the emotional depth of it, and why people behave in gender sort of unequal ways, and the emotional payoff of that in a way.
Big inspiration.
Yeah.
Excellent. So let's get into your own research. So the main thing I would like to talk to you about is your book, Crunch Time, How Married Couples Confront Unemployment. Do you want to start right from the beginning? How did that get started to begin with?
Sure. So this was originally my dissertation, which I did in graduate school. And I mean, the reason I did this is very straightforward. I was reading, in graduate school, I was reading a lot of stuff on work, on gender. We were reading about unemployment, and at that point, we were still reading Mira Komarovsky, Catherine Newman, really beautiful books, but they really focused very much on men's unemployment. And the more I read, the more I found that experiences of women's unemployment, involuntary unemployment, sort of job loss, we really don't have research on that. We really didn't. Partly because job loss and unemployment has just been seen and conceptualized as something that impacts men primarily, especially how it impacts them as breadwinners in their family and so on. And that made sense. It made sense certainly in the 30s when Komarovsky was writing. It made sense in the 80s when Newman was doing her work. It doesn't make as much sense now when women are in the labor force in very large numbers, including women with young children. So I felt that we needed a study to kind of capture the current reality of comparing sort of men's unemployment experiences with women's unemployment experiences, partly because even though women have entered the labor force in large numbers, they are, it's not as though we're at gender equality. We're not there at all, right? So
Yeah.
that was sort of the kind of thrust for the dissertation and the book.
And so what about your methodology? How did you go about collecting your information for it?
Yeah, so my methodology, as you can probably tell, it was very comparative. It was very important for me that I have a comparison of men's unemployment with women's unemployment, so I can really kind of pull out where the differences, where the similarities in the experiences might be. So I focused on that, and for that reason, I decided to focus on dual earner families, and the design really kind of prioritized basically dual earner families, where families of unemployed men, where the unemployed person is the man, and then families where the unemployed person is the woman, with the idea being that these are about as comparable as you can get. So I can really pull out the differences and the convergences. The way I went about recruiting this was, I started collecting data for this project in, I think, around 2013, at which point, this is like the years right after the Great Recession, and what had happened was that kind of job searching had almost become institutionalized as an industry on its own. So you had, a lot of career coaches, career counseling, outplacement firms, but you also had a lot of neighborhood peer-led groups. Now, these all catered to professional, basically, college-educated workers seeking primarily white-collar, higher-level, upper-level work of that kind. And that's the group that's my focus in the study as well. So I basically reached out to career coaches, reached out to outplacement firms, reached out to these neighborhood groups, and kind of got in through that. So I would actually sit through the advice that they were giving to job seekers about how to kind of make yourself competitive in a pretty shoddy economy, to be honest. How do you sell yourself when everyone else is also selling themselves? So that was my way into it. And I would ask, I would tell people, I would pitch my kind of project in like 2 minutes, just say what I was looking for, and then I'd invite them to come talk to me if they were interested in participating or wanted to know more afterward.
So is then kind of in-depth interviews, is that right?
Yeah, so what I did was I'd do an in-depth interview with the unemployed participant, and then at the end of it, I would ask them, I'm also interested in seeing how this has impacted your family, and do you think your spouse might want to talk to me and stuff? And often they said, sure, I'll ask my spouse. And then the spouse may say yes or no. And sometimes they said, no, I don't want to, because things are really tense. And this is not a burden I can impose right now on them, but you can check back with me later on. The other thing that I think is pretty interesting about my methodology is I rely a lot on in-depth interviews, but I also did family observations with couples who were experiencing unemployment. So what that meant was I did family observations with 4 families, which totaled over 200 hours. And I spent about 50 hours with each family, 2 of unemployed men and 2 of unemployed women. And what I was doing was basically I was in their house for a 2-week period, going every day for anywhere from 3 to 8 hours typically each day. I didn't stay with them. I would just kind of go there and hang out to see how basically one spouse's unemployment shaped the daily rhythm of family life. How did they divide up chores? Who was handling, kids or kind of extracurricular activities? How did they talk about job searching? Did they talk about job searching? With one family, I went on a road trip across the state with them when they were going on a vacation. I didn't stay with them for the vacation. I kind of got off, but yeah.
So real proper ethnographic research then.
Yeah, that part of it, yeah.
And just for clarification then, so the people that were unemployed, none of them were unemployed through choice. These are all people that were seeking work or wanted to be on the employment ladder.
Exactly. And these were all people who had lost their jobs. So they hadn't quit. They had either been, there was a variety of things that had happened. Some had been downsized. Some had been laid off. For some, the positions had been eliminated. Some had been fired. Now, all of these are legal distinctions actually that matter in terms of what kind of provision you get. So I didn't focus so much on the reason for it, but that it was something that separation was something they didn't want from the job.
Yeah. So I thought what we could do is perhaps in the first part, look at the experiences of one of the sexes and then look at the other way around. So which one do you want to start with? The experiences of males or the experiences of females? Up to you.
Let's start with the experiences of men, just because it's so normative. I think it fits the contrast nicely. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so with unemployed men, what I observed through the interviews and through the family observations was that this unemployment was seen as like really a moral problem. Like, this is something that's really urgent. We need to fix it as quickly. And the way you fix it is by getting a job, by getting another job. So with families of unemployed men were very focused on kind of emphasizing how men's income was so necessary for the household. Now, this was not actually always the case. Sometimes the men had earned significantly less than the wives. Yeah. Yet it was still framed as we need this because we need a certain level of lifestyle or whatever, which didn't really match on to the economic reality of their household prior, earlier. Anyway, so because they kind of framed men's unemployment as so essential and fundamental to the household economic system, they really prioritized job searching for men. Now, what this meant basically was that couples expected that men's days would be structured around job searching. So that, you sit basically on the computer, maybe 8 hours a day, you have a 40-hour week still, and you're sitting on the computer 8 hours a day submitting stuff, or you're going to networking meetings, networking coffees, things like that, you're in these peer-led groups. But either way, you're focusing, getting a job is your new job. That's literally the terminology that they would use, that, searching for a job is a full-time job. What this meant was that even though unemployed men were often at home and their wives were working, keep in mind these are dual earner couples, so their wives are still employed, there was often not a significant shift in terms of the division of housework. Maybe what I found basically was that for 3/4 of the men, they might change it a little bit. So they did more, more picking up and dropping off kids from school, from other activities because they were around. They might pick up more around the house. They might do more laundry, but there wasn't a significant shift. And their wives still talked in terms of men helping out, right? Like, he'll help me out when I ask him with the laundry and things like that. And the rationale for that often was, well, he needs to find a job, and that's what he needs to focus on. So he can't be distracted from all these other chores. I mean, in one of the families, this is the Jansen family in the book that I talk about, with the Jansen family, the dad would literally go down to the basement and be there working, in what he called office hour timings. He'd be there and they'd tell their daughter, their 4-year-old, that daddy goes to work. So they had a nanny coming in, taking care of the kids, which is really expensive in the US context. This is not a cheap thing to kind of be affording, but this is how important it was for them, kind of maintaining this normal routine. So that basically protected men from housework, but it also really reinforced that men had to be providers. You're getting these resources of time, of space, to job search, but you have to find a job. That's, that's kind of incumbent on you there.
I was just going to ask, actually, just sticking with the men for a moment. So was the pressure coming from the male himself, this burden he felt he had to go and work and provide, or was it coming from the spouse, or both, actually?
It's coming from both. Men had a very strong sense that the way that they can provide to the household has to be an economic provision, that's the way they're best suited to provide. Now, there were some variations from this. Some men were like, well, I'm unemployed, so the way I can provide right now is by contributing more to housework. So there was that, and that was about 1/4 of the families. The wives also were very aware of this, that, men should be providing by earning. And so I had one wife, for example, Emily Bader, who talked about, and her quote was something along the lines of, "I'm sorry, but men do not need to be at home. They need to be out at work." I hate saying that they need to be out at work. So it was that kind of a sentiment. But this is not just an individual thing. Wives also talked about feeling pressure from external sources, from, colleagues or friends or whatever, to kind of show that their husbands were not just unemployed, but that they were trying hard to find a job. Yeah. That, everyone understood that unemployment happens, but why do you remain unemployed? That's the thing that they were trying to ward off.
Yeah, I just wondered if there was an element of an attack on masculinity, if the man felt less of a man for not having the job, and the wife almost had some kind of embarrassment that her husband didn't have the job.
Yeah, both of those things were there. So with men, the other thing that wives talked about, for example, is that, because these are people in professional positions, often very high-ranking positions, where they'd often managed, a team or other workers beneath them. So wives would talk about how, because they don't have that control anymore, they try to exert it by micromanaging things in the house, in the home. Like, oh, why are we getting this sugary cereal and not this other thing? So that also kind of caused some friction.
Yeah. Was there also a reluctance for men to take on any work? They wanted a particular standard of work, maybe a wage that they'd previously earned?
Yeah, that was very much there. So one of the arguments, you saw that with, one example of this is the Radzics, where Jim Radzik, who was unemployed, he'd had a pretty unsteady history of employment in general, and his wife was kind of fed up. And she said to him, she said, I don't care what you do, but you need to go out and kind of get a job. It can be McDonald's, but you need to do something. And he was really miffed by that, partly because they had this very uneven dynamic. When he earned as much as her, but he just hadn't been doing that for like a decade.
Yeah.
So she was kind of the primary earner. And he kept harkening back to when he had been the primary earner, like, over a decade ago and stuff. But he said, how is my time better spent getting like a $10 an hour job at McDonald's, which I think is wrong. I don't even think McDonald's pays that much. But so something like that in the States, as opposed to kind of spending time job searching and getting a job that pays me $200K a year.
Yeah.
So they very much talked about that, I'm professional with this experience. Why should I take a lower job?
Yeah, it's definitely the idea of kind of pride seems to be underpinning this in terms of masculinity.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so.
Great. Thank you, Aliya. That's going to be the end of part 1. In part 2, we'll focus on the females. Hi, welcome back to part 2 of the Sociology Show. Aliya, we talked about the male point of view in the first half. Tell us about the females then in dual earner families if they were facing unemployment.
Yeah, so what happens with families of unemployed women, and keep in mind that in this study, the unemployed women that I had were in dual earner families. These were, again, professional women. They were very comparable to the unemployed men in terms of professional status and in terms of what they'd earned. In fact, I oversampled with women's families, for families where women were the primary earners. So when you look at the overall kind of US population, about 25% of married couples and about 25% women earn more than men. In my study, I think I had about like 50% who earned at least as much or more than men. So these are very dual earner kind of families. My point is that women earned a lot here. So you can't kind of downplay that their income explains things in this study. What happened with unemployed women was that they didn't actually do that. Couples actually did do that. They downplayed the importance of the woman's income. So she'd be earning half or more, and they'd say, well, we don't really need her income. We can get by on like what the husband's income has been. We've been frugal. We've built a family around 1.5 incomes, and summer camps and things like that. We don't really need that. The same things that in families of unemployed men, families that we need this. We're a professional middle class family, and we need vacations. We need a house in a certain kind of neighborhood, which in unemployed women's families, they just say, well, no, we don't need the things that the woman's income would have bought. They were just like, nope, it's okay. We don't need that right now. This just did not match with the economic reality, this kind of framing of it, of frugality and so on. What that meant was, and then they would also talk about how, women would also talk about how, because they were unemployed, they were able to save some money because they were doing childcare, right? So they weren't paying for aftercare or for summer camps and stuff. And they were saving some money, but it didn't match up to the income they had brought in. And they acknowledged that, but it was still, the framing was still very much about what you gain from having the woman be at home, as opposed to her having lost her job. What that meant was because her being at home and unemployed wasn't framed as this urgent problem that needs to be rectified, her job searching wasn't prioritized. So what I found is that women were job searching. They were job searching. That was a criteria for this study. I wanted women who were looking to get back into the labor force, but they were like squeezing it between chores. They were doing it, if they're taking kids to squash practice or theater club or whatever, they're sitting by the bleachers and they're filling out, job applications and things like that. That's how they were doing it. And their day really wasn't organized in this way, in this kind of protected way around job searching, basically, is what I saw. And I think part of this was, and I read about this, was that unemployment, even though it's expected, it's still somewhat stigmatized, especially if it continues, which in the years I was doing this, and especially for professionals, they tend to be unemployed for quite a long time. They tend to be amongst the long-term unemployed, which means unemployed for almost 6 months or more. And that certainly held true for my sample. So there was that sense of stigma, but these women could kind of, they had the option, which men did not have. They could stave it off by sort of saying, well, I'm not an unemployed person, I'm a stay-at-home mom.
Yeah.
That was just much more culturally valued identity that people understood around them. And so that's what they did. They kind of sought basically respite and doing very kind of domestic, very kind of stereotypically feminized things, like getting more involved with children's schools, with children's parent-teacher associations, spending more time with that.
Was it almost described as a career break rather than unemployment?
Yeah, they talked a lot about that. They talked about how, for the first time in years, they didn't feel harried, as though they were trying to kind of one woman, Darlene Bach, she talked about how she always felt like she was kind of pulled at work, that she wasn't able to be as good of a worker as she wanted to be. she felt, even though she was working very long hours, commuting for work, traveling for work, and that she wasn't as present for her son as she wanted. And partly this being present for her son is coming from these norms about, intensive motherhood, the very kind of extensive demands that are put on women to show how they're good mothers, by kind of really making children the center of their world in a way, even while engaging in paid employment, which is a very tough thing to do. So they talked about getting some relief from at least being able to be the kind of mothers that they said they wanted to be.
And I wondered if that then made it more difficult to return back to work. So if they've become more involved in motherhood, looking after the children, spending time with them, reintegrating back into the marketplace might have been quite difficult.
Yeah, so what I actually did follow-up interviews with about half the study. So I kind of went back, 6 months to a year later to be like, hey, how are you? Have you found a job, or how are you doing? What I found is that with women, this kind of being very gung-ho about domesticity, about childcare and stuff, it tended to disappear after a while. 6 months later, they were like, okay, this is enough. I don't need to be doing this. I want paid work again. The kind of sheen had worn off. Except for women with younger kids. That was not necessarily the case for them, which kind of makes sense, right? Like the childcare system is it's abysmal in the US, really. There's no kind of universal affordable childcare that's available. So any childcare would be privatized. So women with younger kids often were like, actually, this might be a good thing. And they talked a lot about looking for what they called mommy hours. So they'd say, I want something that's 9 to 2, or I want something that's part-time so I can take care of everything else around my kids that I want to do. So for the younger women, this happened. This kind of the labor market or kind of re-employment became sort of faded away a little bit. But for the women with older children, that wasn't really the case. They seemed to yearn to kind of get back into the labor force. And yeah.
So, Aliya, from what you're describing, it's still kind of very, very stereotypical. Why do you think it hasn't changed? From what your findings is suggesting, men are still expected to be the provider, and females still the caregiver. So why do you think we still haven't broken that, even though we've got an increase in dual income families?
Yeah, I mean, the way I explain it is I think that that's partly why I study unemployment, actually, because this is a moment of rupture, right? That you could create new ways of organizing families, more gender egalitarian ways of organizing families. I think it has to do with status. I think this male breadwinner family still looms and exerts a powerful influence as a kind of high status ideal to aspire to, that's socially approved, that doesn't need to be explained away, in a way that even like a very egalitarian, very dual earner where men and women both earn but also care equally, it just doesn't hold that influence. So I think it has to do with status, that this is kind of, if you're like upper class and you're elite, that's the kind of family form that you have.
Yeah. I just wonder, and it's rather a depressing thought, but a lot of males are often desired for their status, their power, their wealth, their earnings, and so on. I'd like to think we've got to the end of that, but actually probably not.
No, it doesn't seem so. I mean, you look at kind of research on career progression for men and women, like, for men, not having a job is like a great predictor of divorce.
Yes.
For women, promotion at work is a great predictor of divorce. Yeah. So, you have these very uneven things still going on.
Yeah. Even anecdotally, without mentioning any names, but a few male friends of mine have been offered promotions that they weren't particularly interested in. They didn't want to do it. They didn't want the extra responsibility. And behind the scenes, they had a partner pushing them towards it. Was that common with some of your findings as well?
Yeah. I mean, what I found interesting was that with the unemployed women, for example, many of whom, like I said, had been like the primary earners, what would happen is they wouldn't necessarily see themselves they didn't necessarily see their reemployment as very important in the beginning. It was sort of like, you know what, I've provided a lot, now it's your turn. Yeah. So one woman talked about like, well, you need to man up. And other people talked about how other unemployed women, instead of focusing on their reemployment, would actually turn to their husbands' careers and kind of make sure that was flourishing as a way of managing the family finances, which was very odd. It was like this kind of gender policing that men were doing, but women were doing as well, as wives, as unemployed women, that, men should be at the helm of paid work and unpaid work is for women. Both parties are doing that. It's a very interactional thing that's kind of going on at this very micro level in terms of how they speak to each other, how they behave around each other.
Yeah, because I wondered in reverse as well that many males might have got used to their wife being at home, doing the housework and looking after the children and taking care of those elements. Did they kind of get used to that traditional role?
Yeah, very much so. So with one unemployed man, for example, who had his wife worked, but he had earned a little bit more than her. And so when I interviewed her, she talked about how, she was working very long hours. She said, I was coming back at 8 or 9. My husband's unemployed and dinner's not cooked because they're waiting for me to cook it when I get back. Because these things, and men would talk about this in terms of, they talked about obviously that I need to job search, but they also talked about it in terms of this natural incapability of cooking. I just don't know how to cook. It just doesn't occur to me to take, the food out of the freezer. Yeah. These kinds of things, that this is just not, they're just not used to kind of doing that,
I wonder why so many couples do fall into those natural roles. Have you done any research on that? Because even hopefully moving towards gender equality and post-feminism and so on, you'd imagine that the roles would be far more symmetrical, joint conjugal roles between the male and female. But many couples do seem to fall naturally back into the home carer and the main provider.
Yeah, I really think it has to do with the very kind of developed institution of the marriage. Right? I think if these same couples were sort of just couples who are not married or couples who are living together, I think we might see difference in behaviors. But I think it's something about being in the institution of, especially the heterosexual marriage, where there are very kind of defined ideas that are relatively, they're not very long-standing, but they're relatively well established in terms of how each partner is supposed to behave that exerts a pull. So I think it very much is about the institution.
Yeah.
And not just about them being just couples.
Yeah. And many couples just fall back into that, even if they're not recognizing it instantly to start with.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Aliya. Could you give the listeners some more information about where they can read the book and also how they can get in touch with you if they wanted?
Yeah, sure. So the book is now out. It just came out earlier in June. It's available on Amazon. It's called Crunch Time: How Married Couples Confront Unemployment. It's also available at UC Press. And there's a code, it's 17M662, I believe. If you order from UC Press, you get 30% off. And you can contact me on, I think the best way is via email. I'm on Twitter, Aliya Rao, aliya.rao@gmail.com. And on Twitter, I'm also there at Aliya H. Rao. So those are great ways to get in touch with me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today. It's a really interesting piece of research.
Thanks so much for doing this.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the gofundme.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the sociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.